On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked through me for the Gentiles. Let's pause. And here is a vitally important fact. Look at how Paul says, on the contrary, they didn't teach me anything. On the contrary, they realized that God entrusted me. And here I want to pause. He doesn't say they entrusted me with the gospel to the circumcised. No, he's not saying that the other apostles entrusted him with a specific apostolic mission. No, they didn't entrust him with anything. It was God who entrusted him with the gospel to the circumcised. That is, the Lord himself told Paul, your focus will be directed toward the Gentiles. And what does it mean that Paul didn't preach to the Jews? I once heard a preacher say that God commissioned Paul to preach to the Gentiles. Paul was wrong because he preached to the Jews every time he entered a city. No, he wasn't wrong. The fact that God gave Paul a ministerial emphasis doesn't mean he forbade him from preaching to the Jews, or that he told Peter that his emphasis was to preach to the Jews. It doesn't mean that Peter couldn't preach to the Gentiles. We see Peter preaching to Gentiles when he goes to Cornelius' house. For example, we see Paul preaching to the Jews every time he arrived in a city and preached in a synagogue. Paul is not saying that he could only preach to Gentiles or that Peter could only preach to them.